Hello and welcome as you enter the virtual room here. That's the virtual Annie Blooms behind me. My name's Michael. Thanks for making the time to join us this evening. I'm the events coordinator and publicist at Annie Blooms Books. For those of you who aren't familiar with the store, we're located in Portland, Oregon, in the heart of Multnomah Village. And I'm going to be probably pausing a lot to admit people in because I know we have a lot of people who are registered who aren't here yet. Yeah, here are a couple more. Hello. Thank you for joining us, folks. I was just telling people about the store that we're in Multnomah Village in Portland, Oregon. We've been open for 42 years now, and we are still going strong, despite everything that's going on in the world right now. Our store is back open for limited browsing. For those of you who have missed coming into the store, you are welcome to show up. We're letting in just 2 or 3 parties at a time, and it's limited to 20 minutes. Of course, masked and social distancing and all of that. And if you aren't able to come into the store, welcome to help you at the front door. You can also give us a call, shoot us an email. You can also shop at annieblooms.com day and night, 24 hours a day. We do curbside pickup, local delivery within 3 miles of the store, and a couple of different shipping options. We're open on weekdays from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. and on weekends from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. And we love to hear from people however they want to get in touch with us. So please give us a ring or an email or any of that. Did you know that tomorrow is Independent Bookstore Day all day long? So 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. at our store. I'll be celebrating independent bookstores across the country. If you purchase a book from us in any fashion, online, over the phone, or at the store that day, you'll be entered into a raffle for a $50 gift card. And as in years past, for those of you who know about Independent Bookstore Day, we'll be offering exclusive literary items that day, signed books, usually there's some tea towels, things like that. And those will go on sale tomorrow at 9 a.m. They're all on our website. You can go and check those out. And there's also IndieBound, which is the organization that puts us on, has some virtual readings throughout the day. So you might want to check that out too. We have some readings coming up here. Next week on Tuesday, April 27th, Portland author Jacqueline Keeler will be reading from her new book, Standoff, Standing Rock, the Bundy Movement, and the American Story of Sacred Lands. 2 days after that, on Thursday, April 29th, another Portland author, Jutta Donath. Her memoir is Refugee, The Journey of an East German Woman. Those both sound very cool. Tonight, we are delighted to be hosting John Brehm, who will be reading from his new book, The Dharma of Poetry. I am going to put a link here into the chat so you can go to the event page. We have that book and his older book there available for you to purchase. We would very much appreciate purchasing the book from us. After John reads, there's going to be a Q&A session. We're going to limit it just to the chat because we got so many folks here. We'll make it a little more streamlined there. So if you type questions into the chat now or during the Q&A later, I will read them to John. So feel free to do that anytime. Let me tell you about the Dharma of Poetry. Discover how to engage with poetry to support your spiritual practice, leading to more mindfulness, equanimity, and joy. In the Dharma of Poetry, John Brehm shows how poems can open up new ways of thinking, feeling, and being in the world. Brehm demonstrates the practice of mindfully entering a poem with an alertness, curiosity, and open-hearted responsiveness, very much like the attention we cultivate in meditation. Complete with poetry-related meditations and writing prompts, this collection of lively, elegantly written essays can be read as a standalone book or as a companion to the author's acclaimed anthology, The Poetry of Impermanence, Mindfulness, and Joy, also available at Annie Blooms Books at that link. And John Brehm is the author of 3 books of poetry, Sea of Faith, Help is on the Way, and No Day at the Beach. His poems appeared widely in journals and anthologies including Poetry, The Sun, The Gettysburg Review, The Writer's Almanac, Plume, Best American Poetry, and the Norton Anthology to Literature, and many others. He is the editor of The Poetry of Impermanence, Mindfulness, and Joy. Oh, we just covered that. And the associate editor of the Oxford Book of American Poetry. He lives here in Portland, Oregon, and teaches poetry and meditation classes in Portland and Denver, Colorado. Everybody please welcome John Brehm.
Thank you so much, Michael. Yeah, thank you so much, Michael and Andy, for inviting me into this space to talk about this new book, The Dharma of Poetry. And thanks everybody for showing up. It's so wonderful to see so many friends from all over the place, New York, Canada, Denver. Yeah, I really appreciate your being here, and I'm excited to talk a little bit about this book of essays. So I thought what I'd do is read a couple passages from the first chapter in the book, which is Poetry as Spiritual Practice, and then talk about at least one and maybe a few poems kind of in some depth. And then we'll have, as Michael said, we'll have some time for Q&A afterwards. So before I read from this first chapter, I just wanted to say a couple things about my motivation for writing the book, my intention for writing this book. And one of my motivations was just to bring into greater alignment my own spiritual practice, my Buddhist meditation practice, and my poetry practice. That is the way I teach poetry, the way I read poems in my own writing practice. I wanted to integrate those and to explore the connections between them more deeply. So it was partly for me just an exploration of how those practices were becoming more integrated, and to kind of understand that more deeply. But I also wanted to find a way to engage with poetry that was different from the way poetry shows up in the Dharma world and the way poetry is treated in the academic world. So it's not at all uncommon now to hear a poem read at a Dharma talk, but they're typically read to illustrate a point or to underscore or emphasize an idea. They're not really explored for their own sake or seen as vehicles for embodying and experiencing and teaching the Dharma. They're not really explored in that way. And then at the other extreme, in the academic world, poems, I haven't been in academia for a long time, but when I was a graduate student, if you were to suggest or to focus on the spiritual dimension of a poem, it would be to invite, ridicule, or at the very least, like some quizzical looks, And I assume that that's still the case now, and maybe it's even more so. But just the idea that poems could be a source of wisdom is not something that you will encounter in an academic setting. So I wanted to find a way that was more in depth than the typical Dharma, just reading a poem and kind of allowing it to underscore a point, and then the academic world where the spiritual dimension is just ignored. So this first paragraph that I'm going to read from this essay kind of lays out this new way of reading poetry, which is really not new. Poetry as spiritual practice. One way to bring poetry more deeply into our spiritual practice is to see poems as exemplary, as modeling ways of behaving and modes of awareness that we might wish to adopt as our own. We do this by asking not what poems mean, but what they show, what ways of thinking, feeling, and acting they are explicitly or implicitly endorsing. The English Renaissance poet Sir Philip Sidney understood poetry in this way. He asserted the fundamental truth that witnessing virtuous actions in literature inspires us to act more virtuously ourselves. Writing of Virgil's epic poem, the Aeneid, Sidney asks, who reads Aeneas carrying old Anchises, that's Aeneas's father, on his back, that wishes not it were his fortune to perform so excellent an act? Sidney's A Defense of Poesy published in 1595, is the first fully articulated poetics in English literature. So this notion that poems model behaviors and can serve as teachers, can delight and teach, as Sidney put it, has been around for a long time. It's right at the beginning of our thinking about the role and purpose of poetry. It's also at the foundation of how humans have learned for millions of years. Before we had language, all learning was by example. You didn't explain how to throw a spear or build a fire or help an aged father. You demonstrated it. And this is still quite true. I mean, it's really fundamental to how humans learn. And it occurred to me, like, imagine how difficult it would be to teach somebody how to shoot a jump shot by explaining it to them, with your hands in your pockets, or how hard it would be to learn how to shoot a jump shot by reading an essay about it. We're just sort of hardwired to learn by noticing, by observing, and by imitating. Of course, it's how we all learn language as babies. And I'll just finish the paragraph, and then I want to come back and say a little bit more about that. Of course, seeing poems as exemplary is not the only way to approach poetry, and many great poems will not yield to this kind of reading, but it is one way, and a way that can deepen and support our spiritual practice and inspire us to act more mindfully in the world. So part of what comes into play when we think about this idea that we learn through imitation is mirror neurons. So when we observe someone doing something, the neurons in our own premotor cortex fire in such a way that it feels as if we are doing it ourselves. And I think this is also true for when we read. So as Sidney says, who reads Aeneas carrying old Anchises on his back, that wishes not it were his fortune to perform so excellent an act. And I want to share a passage from this wonderful book, The Master and His Emissary, about the divided brain and Western civilization. And Ian McGilchrist talks about imitation, and he says, there's ample evidence that imitation is extremely infectious. Thinking about something or even just hearing words connected with it alters the way we behave. This was understood by Pascal, who realized that the path to virtue was imitation of the virtuous, engagement in virtuous habits, the foundation of all monastic traditions. So there's that dimension of, when we read a virtuous act, it can be inspiring. It inspires us to act more virtuously, or we can say more mindfully ourselves. But it's not just about actions. And I think with poems particularly, it can be qualities of attention, qualities of awareness. So when we see a poem and we notice, like, what is the poet choosing to pay attention to? Like, what is it that has drawn their attention and which they have chosen to bring into the space of a poem so that our awareness can meet that awareness that's in the poem. So there's that quality. And for me, when I first started writing poems in my late teens, that was, I think, the most powerful attraction to poetry. Was just, it helped me see the world in a way that I had not seen it before. It helped me to pay attention, to learn how to pay attention, and to just stop and look. So when I first read Frost Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, what I found most compelling was not so much what he says in the dramatic ending of the poem and all of that, but it was just the fact that he stops, that he's on a journey from one place to another. It's the darkest evening of the year, it's the winter solstice, But he stops and just watches the snow falling. I mean, nothing dramatic in that, but it inspired me to do that, to stop and look. And that has continued to be profoundly important in my practice as a writer, but also just in my practice as a spiritual being in the world. So there are all kinds of ways, and many of them are quite subtle, that poems model behaviors, ways of thinking and feeling, ways of engaging with the world, that we witness. And if the poem is a truly great poem, we can absorb it deeply, and it will shape the way we think, the way we feel. It's in there really deeply. Even, I don't read poems and try to find, okay, what is it I'm going to imitate here? What is it I'm going to take from this poem? But it gets in there. It just does. It's the nature. We're hardwired for it to do that. The other motivation, or one of the other motivations I had, there was a time 20, 30 years ago where I kept seeing blurbs on back jackets for poems that said something like, "These poems help me to live my life." And of course, everyone knows that blurbs are hyperbolic and mostly untrustworthy. Not the blurbs that I write, but I read that. And I kept seeing it, and I kept thinking, like, I don't know about that. It didn't really make sense to me, and it felt, maybe just something you say when you're writing a blurb. But then I started thinking about it, and I thought, well, maybe what is that true? And if it is true, how would that be? That is, how would reading poems help you to live your life? And the more I thought about it, and the more I thought about my own experience, in the way I've just described, it felt true to me. It felt like there's something there to be explored. So that was another kind of spark. Like, I wanted to see exactly how that was, that reading poetry could help you live your life. So that's one of the things that I explore in the book. And many of the poems that I write about are about a particular kind of experience. They're about boundary dissolving experiences, those moments where the sense of separation falls away and there's this wondrous feeling of communion. And I didn't set out to do that. Just the poems I was most drawn to, at a certain point writing the book, I realized, oh, they're almost all about this kind of experience. And so that, as I'm writing the book, started to reshape my thinking about the overall purpose of the book. And it really is a book about non-separation, about how poems can help us heal that wound of separation, the sense that we're isolated, separate from the earth, separate from each other, trapped in this egoic sense of insecurity and grasping and aversion, that poems can help us break free from that. They can have a liberating quality. And I wanted to just share in this respect a quote from the environmental activist and Buddhist teacher, Joanna Macy. And she says, the crisis that threatens our planet derives from a dysfunctional and pathological notion of the self. It derives from a mistake about our place in the order of things. It is the delusion that the self is so separate and fragile that we must delineate and defend its boundaries, that it is so small and so needy that we must endlessly acquire and endlessly consume, and that as individuals, corporations, nation states, or species, we can be immune to what we do to other beings. So this illusion of separation is really, from the Buddhist perspective, the root cause of the many crises that we are now faced with. So poems can, in describing, in embodying these experiences, if we can enter the poem imaginatively, we can participate in that boundary dissolving experience and begin to heal that sense of separation. So one of the things I say in the book and come back to again and again is that in order to experience that boundary dissolving moment in a poem, we have to first dissolve the boundary that separates us from the poem itself. So typically when we read a poem, if we go to interpreting it or analyzing it, we hold it up as an object of study. And so we're therefore separate from it. So we're here, the poem is here, we're looking at it, we're putting all our energies into trying to figure it out, what it means or what it's saying and so on. But, and that can be a valuable thing to do, but from a spiritual perspective, what's needed, I think, is to enter the poem, to sort of let the critical mind be in the background and just imaginatively enter the poem, be in the imaginative space that the poem creates. And that way we can experience what happens in the poem rather than just think about it. So that is another idea in the poem that I come back to again and again, and I feel is so important. I mean, I feel like the way poetry gets taught, it teaches us to think about the poem and not to experience it, and to put, interpreting the poem, working on it, is more important than actually enjoying it, or just being with it. So yeah, so those are some of the my intentions in writing the book, and some of the themes I kind of come back to again and again. And so I wanted to turn now to a poem by Robert Frost that I talk about in the book. And it's not one of his most famous poems, but it's quite a beautiful poem. And I thought it would be appropriate for Earth Day, or I guess we're in Earth Week now. It's called Tree at My Window. And for those of you who have the anthology, it's on page 91. And in the book, The Dharma of Poetry, it's on 79 if you feel like reading along. Tree at my window. Tree at my window, window tree, my sash is lowered when night comes on, but let there never be curtain drawn between you and me. Vague dream head lifted out of the ground, and thing next most diffuse to cloud. Not all your light tongues talking aloud could be profound. But tree, I have seen you taken and tossed, and if you have seen me when I slept, you have seen me when I was taken and swept and all but lost. That day she put our heads together, fate had her imagination about her. Your head so much concerned with outer, mine with inner weather. There's so much I love about this poem. I've read it many times and taught it many times, but I never tire of experiencing it again. And one of the things that I love most about the poem is just that it's addressed to the tree, that Frost, the poet, is speaking to the tree. It's not a poem about the tree. It's a poem where he's speaking to the tree. So he's treating the tree as if it were a sentient being capable of understanding what he's saying. And another way to think of it is a phrase I came across in a book by Rupert Sheldrake, where he says, the poet's mind is permeable to the tree. It's not closed. There's an opening, and that feels to me very beautiful and very important. And then that Frost, that there's a kind of plea, but let there never be curtain drawn between you and me. I might lower the sash, but don't ever let there be, any kind of absolute separation. And then the next line is just stunning. Vague dream head lifted out of the ground. I mean, I've read lots of descriptions of trees. I've never heard someone call a tree a vague dream head lifted out of the ground. I mean, it's just astonishing. And recently I've been thinking about dendrites in the brain, the structures that are outgrowths of the cells that look, and they're involved in communication with other cells, but they look exactly like trees. I mean, it's not like they look a little bit like trees. Like if you took an image of a dendrite and an image of a tree and put them side by side, you wouldn't necessarily be able to pick which was which. So it's quite astounding to me. And I don't know if Frost would have been aware of that. He may have been. But in any case, it's there, that similarity. And the fact that dendrites are involved in sending signals between cells, between neurons rather, seems to me significant. So vague dream had lifted out of the ground. And thing next most diffuse to cloud, not all your light tongues talking aloud could be profound. The leaves clicking, not all of them could be profound, but that suggests that some of them could be. And then there's this turn in the poem where he says, but tree, I have seen you taken and tossed. And if you have seen me when I slept, you have seen me when I was taken and swept and all but lost. And that for me is the heart of the poem. There's this empathic resonance between the poet and the tree. I have seen you taken and tossed in storm. And if you have seen me when I slept, you have seen me when I was taken and swept and all but lost in my own storms. But that empathic resonance, like that is something that I think is so potent in this poem and in many poems, and something that we feel very deeply when we enter the poem in the way that I describe. And, you know, at this point in Frost's life, I mean, his father died when he was 11 and left the family with $8. So quite a traumatic event. His mother died when he was 20. But more crucially and tragically, at the time he wrote this poem, 2 of his children had died. One child died at the age of 4. His first son died at the age of 4 of cholera. And Frost blamed himself at times for not calling the doctor sooner. I mean, they lived on a farm, and you can imagine what that would do to you to have to live with that grief and that maybe self-accusation. And then another daughter died a day after she was born. So there's a lot of trauma in Frost's life. And so when he says, if you have seen me when I slept, you have seen me when I was taken and swept and all but lost. I mean, there's a profound, upwelling of grief in the poem there. But he says it so beautifully. I mean, the stanzaic container of that emotion is so lovely that it doesn't overwhelm the poem. But that empathic resonance, and there's a wonderful Austrian spiritual teacher that my wife and I, Alice, and I have been listening to lately, Thomas Hubel. And he describes empathic resonance as, I feel you feeling me. I feel you feeling me. Not just I feel you, but I feel that you are feeling me. And that seems to me what's happening in this poem. Like Frost feels the tree feeling him. And that the power, the comforting quality of that seems quite evident in the poem. And then the wonderful ending, that day she put our heads together. Fate had her imagination about her. Your head so much concerned with outer, mine with inner weather. Just gorgeous writing, just beautiful. And kind of wonderful that in the first 3 stanzas, it's A, B, B, A, B, B, A. There's a kind of a couplet in the middle of the first and last line rhymes. but in the last stanza, all the lines are rhymed together: her, outer, whether, and they're all feminine rhymes, which is interesting. Yeah, so when I think about this poem, as what can we learn, or in what ways is this poem exemplary? What if my theory of poetry, I'm not sure it rises to the level of a theory, but my way of reading poetry, if I'm suggesting that poems are exemplary, that they model ways of behaving, ways of being in the world, what would it be in this poem? And I wish we could just have a discussion about it with all of you, rather than having to just hear me talk about it. But I think speaking to the tree, that seems to me hugely significant. That is to assume that consciousness is not locked in the human brain, that other beings have awareness, have consciousness, and that they can be responsive to our own awareness. So that's something that the poem demonstrates. Frost is not saying, here's what's true, or here's what I would recommend for you when you find yourself next to a tree. And yet, when we see it in a poem like this, we may feel like, oh, maybe that's the truth. Maybe that's how things really are. Or maybe I can, what would it be like to move through the world with the sense that, trees and other beings, animals, plants, rocks, rivers are conscious, which is, of course, how humans have thought and what they have known to be true for millennia. It's only in the past few hundred years that we have talked ourselves out of that. So that's one thing. And then, I think this empathic resonance, just feeling into that. And then, I think the more we experience moments of empathic resonance, and how good that feels when we're in resonance, the more we want to experience it, and the more we notice how it feels when we're not in resonance, when we're disconnected or feeling disconnected. And so that can become an aspiration that the poem holds out to us. So those, I think, are the main things that that the poem feels like it's offering, or rather modeling for us, and implicitly endorsing. I think every poem, in doing what it does in the way that it does, is saying to us, I endorse this way of being, this way of feeling, this way of thinking. And so, we may take that in. So yeah, there's probably obviously more to say about that poem, but I thought I would maybe just read a few others. And I'm limited in my choices of what I can read, because, believe it or not, you have to get permission from the publisher to read a poem in a space like this, if it's not in the public domain. And that Frost poem is in the public domain. But I'll read you this short poem by Saigyo, and my publisher owns the rights to this poem, so they won't object. Saigyo, a 12th century Japanese Buddhist poet, wandering monk, a little 5-line waka poem. Quiet mountain hut by a rice patch, till a deer's cry just outside startles me, and I move, so startling him, we astonish one another. Isn't that wonderful? We astonish one another. But again, it's this moment of empathic resonance. It's like quiet mountain hut by a rice patch. You have to assume he's maybe meditating. Till a deer's cry just outside startles me, and I move, so startling him, we astonish one another. It's the feeling is co-arising and happening simultaneously in the poet and the deer, and then he's seeing it. And then, of course, because he has human language, he can say it in this lovely poem. But And I wonder what the Japanese word for, I mean, I wonder, astonished seemed, Alice and I were talking about this before, what a great word choice that is. We astonish one another, not we surprise one another, we astonish one another. And then before we open it up to questions, I thought I would read one more poem. And this is a poem by the Chinese poet Shuangzi, the younger contemporary of Lao Tzu, Taoist philosopher, poet, storyteller. And it's called The Joy of Fishes, and it's translated by Thomas Merton. The Joy of Fishes. Shuangzi and Huizi were crossing Hao River by the dam. Shuang said, "See how free the fishes leap and dart? That is their happiness." Hui replied, "Since you are not a fish, how do you know what makes fishes happy?" Shuang said, since you are not I, how can you possibly know that I do not know what makes fishes happy? Hui argued, if I, not being you, cannot know what you know, it follows that you, not being a fish, cannot know what they know. Shuang said, wait a minute, let us get back to the original question. What you asked me was, how do you know what makes fishes happy? From the terms of your question, you evidently know I know what makes fishes happy. I know the joy of fishes in the river through my own joy as I go walking along the same river. Such a great poem. It's so wonderful. I mean, I love this argument, this philosophical argument they're having about, kind of epistemology, like how do we know what we know? And Hui is saying, well, there's no way you can know. There's no rational basis for your knowing. and I love the power, the kind of inarguable rightness of the assertion at the end of the poem when Shuang says, I know the joy of fishes in the river through my own joy as I go walking along the same river. And again, it's that empathic resonance. It's that feeling, like I feel this connection, this deep connection, this deep resonance, and I trust that. I don't question that. I feel it and I know it. And so that there's great power in that poem. I think, we have convinced ourselves that we don't have access to that kind of empathic resonance, that there's no rational kind of scientific basis for it. But in fact, it's something that we, on some deep level, we know to be true. And these poems remind us of that truth. I think they remind us, part of what makes them so powerful is that they tell us what we already know. On some level, we know what they're telling us, but the poems kind of light that up and confirm it in a way that can be really powerful. So yeah, I'll leave it there. And we have about 20 minutes for questions. So I'm happy to try to answer any questions that may have come in. And if there aren't questions, I can read another poem or whatever you guys want to do.
Yeah, we had a few questions, but the first person who asked has gone. And the second person who asked, someone else who's attending, answered that question. So we have no pending questions, but feel free to type some in there, folks, and I will be happy to read them to John. Or you can sort of vote by not asking a question that you would like him to read more poems. Or you can type in more poems, whatever you want to do.
All right, well, I'll read another poem by oh, actually, you know what? I was going to read this Whitman poem. I'll read this Whitman poem. I think this is a really important poem for our particular moment culturally. It's called Reconciliation. And it's a poem that Whitman wrote at the end of the Civil War. Reconciliation. Word over all, beautiful as the sky, beautiful that war and all its deeds of carnage must in time be utterly lost, that the hands of the sisters death and night incessantly softly wash again and ever again this soiled world. For my enemy is dead, a man divine as myself is dead. I look where he lies, white-faced and still in the coffin. I draw near, I bend down and touch lightly with my lips the white face in the coffin. And I talk about this in the book that, Whitman spent 3 years during the war just visiting sick and dying and wounded soldiers in the hospitals around DC. And he would sit with them for hours and just listen to them or talk with them. He would write letters for them. Many of them were illiterate. He would bring them gifts, whatever they needed or most wanted. It's quite a beautiful bodhisattva example that Whitman set there. And, he saw these young men dying, in these terrible conditions. I mean, the hospitals were just ghastly overcrowded and lots of infection and gangrene and just really, really awful. And these young men, 15, 16, some of them, and he came to love them. And so tremendous outpouring. But one of the things that's most striking about Whitman's service in this poem is that he did this for Confederate soldiers as well as Yankee soldiers, even though his brother had been captured and wounded and nearly died in Confederate prison, and that, his compassion made no distinctions. So it's just a wonderful example, when we can get so caught up in, our side is right, their side is wrong. It's so hard to feel compassion. And yet you have an example here of just a transcendent example of compassion. And so a poem like this can help us to aspire to that ourselves. And we may not get there, but we can hold the aspiration. Yeah. So now it looks like there's a few questions coming in.
Yeah, Justin Rigamonti, is there a contemporary poet whose poetry has this empathic resonance demonstrated in their work?
Oh, that's a good question. I think I can't think of somebody where that's the dominant quality. I feel the way it's so strong in Whitman. It's really strong in Neruda. I feel it very strongly in Neruda. But it's kind of a fundamental aspect of poetry. I think, if that's not there, then the poems aren't going to move us very deeply. They're not going to have that kind of heart quality that I think, poems can do all kinds of things and they can be intellectually very engaging. But I think that empathic resonance is primary, and I think really fundamental to what poems are and what they do. It just shows up in kind of different ways. But yeah, I always, when I see it in a poem, I feel it really deeply, and I'm always glad to see that quality shine forth in a poem. But I can't think of somebody who just immediately jumps to mind. Maybe you know somebody like that. But yeah, I think it's really there. And I think as poets, we can aspire to that, we have those moments to write about those moments in our poems. I've been trying to do that more. So yeah. And I think maybe other questions.
Yeah. Denny wants to know, when you say one way to look at why one would write a poem is to inspire virtuous action, what separates such practice from being perceived as pretentious? As we write something which we aspire to be instead of what we are, some would interpret that as being ingenuine.
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I think a poem, whatever it is about or whatever it tries to do, if it doesn't feel genuine, then we're going to sense that, and we're not going to be able to really connect deeply with the poem. I think the poems I'm most drawn to in this respect are not the poems that say, the great Rilke poem, "You must change your life," or poems that are directive, that use the imperative voice, "you must," or "you should," or you will, or, there are a lot of poems like that. I'm thinking of like Rumi poems and Hafiz and Mary Oliver, maybe, and some other poets, where they're kind of telling you how things are. And I sort of recoil from poems like that. I think, like in the poems I've just read, for me, there's no, so Whitman's, what he does there, you could certainly describe that as a virtuous action, right? I mean, to have that kind of compassion for your enemy, but there's nothing. Whitman isn't saying you should do this or this is how it should be done. He's just showing you what he did or what he imagined doing. And so that, for me, removes any quality of pretentiousness. I think the questioner is right to, that's a pitfall. And I think, anytime you feel pretentiousness in a poem, when I feel that, even just a whiff of it, it's over, like I completely kind of check out. So I think it's really important to be aware of that. But I think in these poems, because they're demonstrating and embodying these qualities rather than arguing for them or prescribing them to us, keeps them from having that quality of feeling pretentious. Yeah.
Nice. Matt says, "I am very new to poetry. Your book is one of my first. What other works would you recommend?"
That's it. That's all.
Well, your other book, right?
More my other book. Yeah,
Yeah.
all my books. That's sufficient. Well, yeah, if you resonate with the poems that I've written about, the poets that I write about, I would explore those poets. I think, honestly, the anthology, The Poetry of Impermanence, Mindfulness, and Joy, the poems in there are really accessible. Like there's nothing, there are no head scratchers in there where you have to kind of like wonder what the hell's going on in this poem. Like, I have no idea. There's a lot of poems like that out there, but you won't find them in this anthology. So that would be a good place to start. And then just kind of trust your intuition, just follow, what you find and what you like. And, when you find a poem that you like and you read more of that poet, like I would dive deep, like, really explore that poet and get to know them. I will say there's a wonderful Portland poet who's in the room tonight, Andrea Hollander, and I would recommend her poems very highly. Justin Rigamonti is a wonderful poet. Ron Bloodworth. There's so many. I can't see everybody in the group, but there's a lot of wonderful poets in Portland, worthy of exploring. But yeah, it's anthologies are good ways. If you walk into a bookstore and just start pulling books off the shelf, it can be frustrating. So anthologies to give you a taste of what's out there. I've been reading recently Kevin Young's anthology, The Art of Losing, Poems of Grief and Healing. There's just a lot of really wonderful poems in there. So yeah.
Carrie typed this one to me. Could you say something about aspiration? It lives alongside inspiration and expiration and is also about breath. But what would you say?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, cool question, huh?
Aspiration, inspiration. What was the other?
Expiration.
Exploration.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, they're all connected, right? Inspired, comes from the same root as to breathe. So yeah, I think inspiration is so important for us as writers and as readers, and lots of it's sort of unfashionable to talk now about inspiration. There's a way in which many poets will talk about poetry as being hard work, and it is that, but that quality of inspiration, that mysterious quality that, we can't make happen, but when it does happen, it's such a beautiful feeling, as we read and as we write, really important. And yeah, I find, holding aspirations, rather than I should be a better person, or I should do this or that, or but having, just holding the aspiration, with some kindness, can help us to open and deepen our practice, whatever it might be. And yeah, I think I'll be content with answering half of that question.
Sounds good. Katie Phillips, I think this kind of goes back to the beginning of your talk. How is the joy or experience of intellectual study of a poem different from the immersive experience of a poem?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, that goes right to the heart of it. And I felt a little bit of a conflict in this book, because on the one hand, I'm saying, like, don't think about the poem, or don't let that be your foreground experience. Like, just enter the poem imaginatively and be with it. But of course, I'm thinking about the poems in writing about them. I'm not just, kind of going, wow. I'm saying things about them, thinking about them. So I think it's maybe a question of sequence. So I think entering the poem, like, not worrying about what it's saying, not thinking about it intellectually or analyzing it, having the initial experience be one of entering and being without worrying too much about, I don't understand that line, or that image doesn't quite make sense, or I'm a little lost here and I'm frustrated, like letting that go, or, getting too caught up in the thoughts that may come, like, oh, this reminds me of a Wordsworth poem, or, whatever it might be, to kind of let that be in the background and just experience the poem and notice and appreciate. I mean, just really be with what you love about a poem and savor those moments, the lines and images, the feelings that arise, and just really be with that first. And then it can be really deepening experience to think about the poem. For me, for that Frost poem, I know a fair amount about his life. So, and this isn't intellectual, but knowing, it draws on knowing rather than just being with. So knowing that Frost had lost 2 children at the time he wrote that poem, and how he points to that, the agony and grief of that, without really going into it. But knowing that, for me, adds a whole other layer to the poem. So it can be really helpful to know about the poet's life. For poets like Frost, there's a biography, there's letters, all those things can be, I think, really helpful, much more helpful than reading critical commentary, which can be pretty heady and can kind of get in the way of, it can be helpful too. But I think, yeah, knowing about the poet's life can be really deepening. Yeah, so maybe it's a question of sequence, experiencing first, being with, and then, letting the interpretive aspect of the mind get more involved.
All right. I hope I'm not butchering this person's name. Roni Davis, maybe? Says, one of your writing prompts is to read only the first line of a poem, then contemplate that and let it generate your own poem. Can you say more about that process?
Well, first of all, I say this in the book, but this is a practice that I learned from Andrea Hollander, who's with us. So it's her practice. But I think when we get stuck as writers, it's often hard to get started. And so the way Andrea explained it to me is that you just pick a line at random and you just read that first line, and then you close the book so you don't see what that poet does with it. And then you just take it and run with it. And it can be quite liberating. So you've got to start, you've got something to work with. And you can treat it, really as just having fun, and seeing where it goes. And I think that can be, the times I've done it has been quite wonderful. You may not end up with a poem that you like, but it's an invitation to let the imagination just kind of run wild for a little bit. And yeah, it's delightful. I'm sure Andrea could say a lot more about it, but yeah, check it out. Yeah, I would experiment with that. Yeah.
All right, let's see if we have any others. This is not a question, but you might want to respond. Fred Muratori, maybe the most instructive, in quotes, poems begin as unintentional exercises in self-revelation that can in turn be sources of self-revelation in the reader. Not sure many poets would comfortably wear the mantle of teacher or instructor.
Unintentional exercises in self-revelation.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. That's great. And what was the rest of it?
For the writer and the reader. And then the second part is, not sure many poets would comfortably wear the mantle of teacher or instructor.
Yeah. I think that's true. But I mean, just to stay with that first, unintentional exercises in self-revelation. Yeah. I think, if we just bring a kind of curiosity to our own experience and to what's happening in us, and bring that to the page, it can be quite exciting. I know for me, at times when I have been kind of in a drought, sometimes I'll just say, well, what's happening? Like, what's happening in my inner world? Like, what is most prominent? And just let that lead me into the poem. But yeah, you're right. I don't think many poets would be comfortable with a mantle of, sage or teacher. And certainly I'm not suggesting that. But I think it's quite true, though, that poems can be sources of wisdom. And it partly depends on the attention we bring to them and what we're looking for. And, this isn't true for all poems. And I certainly don't want to kind of make the claim that this is the way to read poetry and every poem will be illuminated if you look at it in this way. I don't think that's true. But I do feel like poems can be teachers, that they can be sources of wisdom, that they can help us live our lives. Yeah.
A while ago, Justin Rigamonti also asked, and maybe this would be a nice way to close the evening, could you read us a new poem of yours?
I don't have anything right in front of me. That's such a kind question. Let me think now how I could do this. Well, I'll read you a very, very, very short poem, easy one to memorize. It's called On Turning 64. The slowing down is speeding up.
All right.
So there you go.
That's as many words as Hemingway's shortest short story.
Oh, right. Yeah. Remind me of how that goes. The shoes, the baby shoes.
Yeah, baby shoes for sale, never used, or something like that.
Something like
I can't
that, yeah.
remember. Yeah. Oof.
And in the mind spins a story. And then, of
Yeah.
course, it's from the lineage of my teacher, A.R. Ammons, who has a wonderful short poem called Their Sex Life. One failure on top of another.
That is fantastic. Yeah.
So yeah. So anyway, I guess we're done. So thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate you being here. It was wonderful to talk with you about the book, and thank you for the questions, and thank you for your attention and your presence. Yeah, thanks so much. And thanks, Andy and Michael and Annie Blooms.
Thank you so much. It was a great, great event. Thanks everyone for coming, and we hope to see you at another event some other time. We're recording this and it'll be up on our YouTube channel sometime tomorrow afternoon. For those, people who missed the event and want to let them know about it, they can check it out there. All right, thanks. Good night, everyone.
Thanks so much, everybody. Great to see you all.